love the graphic I was telling Gabe the other day, the school wars theme. That's a fun theme. I did want to mention that in the classical, for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm the director of the Association of Classical Christian Schools. I wrote a book that had battle in the title of it, and so obviously the war theme works pretty well for us at the ACCS. However, I did want to talk a little bit about how we are coming to a time when we need to return to our roots in classical Christian education a little bit. Before I do that, I'll explain why. I've seen recently that there's been something of a development in classical Christian education. A segment of classical schools are pursuing what they call culture care as opposed to culture war, as though you can care for something that isn't human. Cultures aren't human. Cultures are the result of sin or righteousness that comes through community. And therefore, I think it's very appropriate that we war against an evil and ugly culture. And I think that's been the way classical Christian education has been seen for a long time. This past year, I wrote the follow-on to Battle for the American Mind, the book that I did with Pete, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But the follow-on is called Forging the American Mind, and what it is about is sort of the field guide on how to do classical Christian education. And as I did that, I was struggling to understand this trend that was occurring in classical Christian education, where more and more people seem to be pursuing it for its own sake. Now, anything good can be turned ugly when you pursue it for its own sake. Nothing should be pursued for its own sake. Art for art's sake is not art, it's ugliness. Classical education for its own sake can be evil. What I mean by that is that there was a time in the 19th century where humanism dominated the academy, and during that time it became fashionable to look to the great books of the Western world and see them as an end in themselves, to pursue them because it's a joy to learn, to develop a love of learning in students, to create human flourishing, as it's often called. All of these things can be good things, but what we're in danger of right now is that some in the classical Christian movement are drifting into the lane of making it the purpose of classical Christian education. And the purpose of anything has to be the image of Christ. We have to pursue Christ, and that needs to be the reason in which we're pillaging the Egyptians, for example, an early phrase that was spoken of often in the classical Christian movement, that we pursue things not because they're good in and of themselves, that's a humanistic pursuit, but because we can take gold from them and claim it for the king, for King Jesus. So when I was writing this book, I came back to Dorothy Sayers' original essay. Now, over the years, I have come to only remember the work, not really to have reread it, and I would encourage anybody who may be in classical education to reread it, because I found the gold in that essay is at the beginning and the end. There's a middle part that talks about ages and stages and how kids grow up through grammar, logic, and rhetoric, but that's really just sort of an observation Sayers made. I think her greater contribution was that she starts out saying that we're teaching kids to read, but we're not teaching them how to think. And what she means by that, and then she goes on to say that the reason we have failed to teach them how to think is because we've abandoned the medieval liberal arts. Now, one of the things that you'll find if you look at the medieval liberal arts is they are not the classical liberal arts. So just to repeat, the medieval liberal arts are not the classical liberal arts. They were the liberal arts that were categorized and named the three ways. That's what the Latin trivium means, the three ways, and the four ways, the quadrivium. So why did the medievals take these seven arts that the historic classical understanding of these seven arts and recompose them into the three ways and the four ways? The three ways and the four ways to what? What they were, according to Sayers, is the way to come to a knowledge of the truth, or, for a $2 word, an epistemology. And the medievals had a unique way of thinking about the liberal arts that was uncharacteristic of the classical era. And if you go back to the classical era for all of your understanding of the trivium, you'll end up with humanism, which is precisely the problem we're facing today in the movement. What you find is the medievals applied a few correctives to the classical trivium. The first corrective that they applied was that they broadened it, because the original trivium was geared towards political argument, almost exclusively towards debate and argument. The medievals reconsidered it and rethought about it as a way of coming to know the truth. And of course, the pursuit of truth is a uniquely Christian exercise. The pursuit of the truth as Christ gives it as the way, the truth, and the life. Notice two of those words, the way, the trivium is a way, the truth, and the life. How do we live it out? So the medieval concept of education began with this trivium, and it expanded it to say, what if we come and reason together as Christians to come to a knowledge of the truth? Now, why would we go about the exercise of doing that? Well, if you know the truth, you can live by it. And this time period, when this was happening, was about 1080 to about 1300. And during this time period, Christians said, if Christ is king, what does that mean about commerce? What does that mean about government? What does that mean about law? What does that mean about medicine? What does it mean about astronomy? If Christ is king, it matters for everything. It is not just a head exercise. We can't just get into classical education because we flourish. The point of classical education is to point to Christ. That is what it does, but only if it's medieval classical education. So with the trivium, you saw rhetoric expand into what the scholastic centers would gather together and have roundtable debates, not for the sake of arguing with each other, but for the sake of finding truth more effectively, because they were engaging logically, using the scriptures to find truth. Anselm, in about 1080 to 1100, made the argument that he did not come to knowledge so that he could know God, but rather he believed in God so that he could know. This was translated into the epistemology of the medieval education as theology is the queen of the sciences, which meant that at every university that they created, and yes, the university was invented in this time frame by these Christians, it was designed to bring all thoughts into the captivity of Christ. When he did that, or when they did that, they put the theology, the Christian abbots and monks, at the head of the table, because it was theology that would drive a search for truth. The tools of the trivium and the quadrivium had to be subservient to an understanding of theology, and especially special revelation in Scripture. And on top of this, you had one more idea that superimposed on this epistemology. So you had the trivium, the quadrivium, theology is the queen of the sciences, and the last element was synthesis. It was an idea that we most associate with Thomas Aquinas, but it really predates him to another gentleman, Albertus Magnus. Its idea was that because God is one, all things should make sense together. We don't have lots of little silos for politics and religion and all of the various elements of life. It all works together. If something's true here, it's also true there. This was a highly worldviewish kind of education. And it translated into the primary engine that drove the development of Western civilization. What we call Western civilization now, they called Christendom. Christendom. Christendom depends on this small orchard that sits outside the city and feeds the city through education. Education is the pursuit of knowledge as it's applied, which isn't very popular these days. That's why they shot Charlie Kirk. They shot him because he was taking Scripture and he was applying it to every aspect of life. And the people who didn't like the ramifications of that couldn't argue, so they shot him, right? That's war. And unfortunately, for us, the enemy uses weapons. We, of course, conduct war differently, because as Christians, we use the whole armor of God, the Word, the Spirit, our minds, our righteousness. So as we look at classical Christian education today, what we call that whole exercise is paideia. David referred to that a number of times as in his prior talk. Paideia is a word that it was interesting when I started working with Pete Hegseth on Battle for the American Mind. He was enamored with this concept because he'd never heard of it. And he catches on quick. He's a fairly smart man, very smart man. And he finally just put it all together and said, this is what could change our culture. This is what could actually change the culture. Reshaping from the paideia in our book, if you recall, we talked about how the progressives took the Christian paideia out of schools, got rid of, for example, the Apostles' Creed and put the Pledge of Allegiance in its place, although the early Pledge of Allegiance had no God in it, and that's the one that they replaced it with. Then they replaced that with an American paideia, where we worshiped the country and the Constitution as though it could be the center of our paideia. And then they moved us to cultural Marxism, because it was easier for Christians to love America than it was cultural Marxism. But eventually, cultural Marxism became more viable, and that's in about 2000 where we moved as a culture, was to a Marxist paideia. Our effort is to return to a paideia of the Lord, Ephesians 6. Fathers, raise your children in the fear and admonition, education, training, discipline. There's 7 or 8 words I've found in various versions of scriptures that are used there, but paideia is the Greek word because it's an encompassing word. It's an all-enveloping word. It's a very complicated word. But essentially what paideia is it begins with a narrative. So when it comes to your children, and I'll try and drive home now at the end of this talk, what we can do as Christians to try and respond to this, educate our children in the paideia of the Lord, not in some form of Christian humanism or some form of culture care instead of culture war. What we want is to form warriors who are capable of using the fruits of the Spirit and the weapons of the Christian soldier. So as we look at that, paideia starts out with a myth, a story, where we came from. So that's the first thing you have to have. Now, of course, the scriptures give us the true story, the true myth, the myth that begins with Adam and the fall and ends with Christ in judgment over all the nations. So we've started out, paideia starts with a myth, it starts with a story, but there are many true stories that are not the one true story. We have the stories, of course, of Brothers Karamazov. We have the stories of Milton and the Paradise Lost. The stories throughout the great books are very useful and very fruitful for building that narrative, as long as they are viewed as gold to be harvested and reclaimed rather than something that's good in and of itself. So with that beginning of myth being the story we believe about ourselves, the next thing that paideia developed in a child is worldview. What are the foundational truths? So now we're not talking narrative, we're talking about what are the order of truths. Is it true that Christ is man? Yes. Is it true that he is God? Yes. Is it true that his nature is threefold or twofold in that? The Trinity, all of the parts of theology that we learn are part of the worldview that we have as we put that together. So that's where the catechisms and the development of a child through regular church attendance, Bible reading, make sure that they're saturated in a worldview that is true and not false. So we've got myth and we've got worldview. And the last one, and this is the one that's a little harder, fewer people see it, but this is a key one for classical education, and that is the development of the affections, the right ordering of affections, as Augustine puts it. And this concept is, of course, the ordo amoris, sometimes it's called. It is the idea that we don't live in a sort of a Boolean black and white world, even though a lot of Christians try and claim that that's true. We don't live in a black and white world. We live in an ordered world. God is a God of order. He orders higher things and lower things. Do we love our neighbor? Yes, we love our neighbor, but not at the expense of the higher good, which is loving God. So we first love God, then we love our neighbor. It is actually possible to sin by loving your neighbor, right? It's not cast against something. You can sin by loving your neighbor more than you love God. So this is the ordered set of loves, and this stack begins and ends. It's a long stack. Children need to be able to put everything in its rightful order. There's many examples of this. I don't have time to go into them now, but those three elements, the myth, the worldview, and the right ordered affections, are essentially what paideia is, at least in its quickest form, which a lot of people call enculturation, which brings us back to our concept of culture war. The problem with culture care, or looking to classical education as an end in itself, or looking to the books and the trivium that we're going to teach them how to think, not what to think, for example, that is not classical Christian education. We don't teach them how to think, not what to think. We teach them how to think and what to think, because we believe there is truth and we believe we are wiser than a teenager, right? So this confusion in classical education might find its way in corners. It's hard to see at first because it's hidden in some very good clothing that looks a lot like classical education. But I like to refer to it as either the culture war or the paideia form of education. And when Pete and I wrote the book, we got to the end, and Pete said, okay, we just blew the whistle on the progressives and what they'd done to take over the country. We've told people what classical Christian education is. If you've seen the book, it's chapters 7, 8, 9, 10. That's all what is classical Christian education. It explains that. How do we end this thing? We got to bring it home. And so Pete and I were talking, and I said, didn't you do something in the military in Afghanistan? What were you doing over there? And he said, I was a counterinsurgency officer. And I said, what in the world is counterinsurgency? And he went on to explain that it's really trying to move within the culture of a people to get them to press against the influences, in his case, of the Taliban, right? The Taliban's cultural influence was strong. As a counterinsurgent, his job was to try and provide a counter to that. And I said, well, Pete, that's what we're trying to do. Why don't you finish it out? And so as he finished out the book, you'll see the call for insurgency in the book. And that's what we're here for today. That's why I love the title, School Wars. Because our weapons are not guns. I know that a lot of people in here probably like guns. That's fine to like them, but they're not what we trust in. We don't trust in chariots. We don't trust in guns. We don't trust in our brute force. What we trust in is that through school, education, pastors in our churches, and most importantly, as a former headmaster, I say this with with high emphasis, the family. What goes on in the family far exceeds anything our schools do in the classical Christian movement. So even if you don't have a classical Christian school in your area, and if you want to start one, ACCS would love to help you do that. We have a whole suite of services on our website. You can look at that. There's advertisement done. Even if that isn't your thing and you want to homeschool, that's great. Whatever you do, every Sunday, Dad takes the whole family to church. Every Sunday, the kids hear the word, get the communion, learn the catechisms. Don't forsake the catechisms, and don't forsake reading at bedtime, and read good children's stories to them. And I really would encourage you, my age, all my kids are grown. I worked in education the entire time that they were growing up, and my most cherished moments were reading great children's books to my kids. And they remember that as one of the few memories they have of their father in those really little years, simply because, other than the occasional vacation where I took adventure a little too seriously, they didn't exactly remember a lot of me, because obviously Mom was the one feeding them and clothing them, but they did remember every night I read to them. And so with that, I will close, but I just want to encourage you, thank you, Fight, Laugh, Feast, for your work in the culture war. We are at war, not with the people, with the powers of darkness that are running roughshod over the people right now. We need to love the people by fighting the war. So I'll end with that.